The member for Fredericton Southern, leader of his party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to read on rise on second reading of Bill 6. I think it was a year ago, actually, Mr. Speaker, I proposed an amendment at committee stage to have Section 6 removed from the then Climate Change Act bill, because it didn't make any sense, because I knew it wasn't going to cut the mustard with the federal government. So I actually proposed an amendment to remove Section 6 then. So good on the government for following through on removing this section of the Climate Change Act. I'll speak a little more on it in a minute, but I do want to acknowledge the decision to leave the objectives for our targets in terms of our carbon budget for 2030 and 2050 at least not weaken them in the bill, in the act. This is important. At some point we may have to even strengthen them, Mr. Speaker. But at this point, these were long held and negotiated with our adjoining provinces and states. We've been working away towards these various benchmarks with respect to climate action for some time. However, Mr. Speaker, speaking of amendments, I also previously had moved an amendment at committee to turn those objectives into actual targets that were legally binding, and they remain as objectives. So on the flip side of this, it's disappointing at this point that the bill as presented does not turn these objectives into actually legally binding targets. Mr. Speaker, the thing that we need to understand with respect to meeting these targets is that there's a lot of work to do. A lot of work to do, and it falls into a number of areas, starting with efficiency, and more efficiency, Mr. Speaker, to ultimately reduce the role that fuel electricity plays in meeting our needs. So we need less, Mr. Speaker. That's efficiency. That's not just some tinkering around the edges with a bit of weather stripping and caulking. This is serious upgrading of our housing stock across this province, serious upgrading of our commercial buildings across this province, industrial processes across this province, to substantially reduce the demand for fuel and electricity in New Brunswick, across Canada, and globally. This is an essential element of moving towards a low-carbon economy, Mr. Speaker. To do so requires good policy. It requires good fiscal measures. It requires a source of revenue, Mr. Speaker, to provide the financing that's so necessary. You know, it's not, incentives are, always helpful at some level, Mr. Speaker, but the big hurdle for most people and most small businesses to tackle the challenge of efficiency and more efficiency is the upfront capital costs. While the payback is there and fairly quick, people, households, and businesses have lots of priorities. And if they've got a little additional money to spend, it's likely to go other places. Even though this makes economic sense in the short term to find the money to invest in energy efficiency, reducing the demand for energy, shrinking the carbon footprint, which of course is a societal benefit here. So there is a critical, essential role for government to play to ensure that households and businesses invest in energy efficiency and do so significantly to get that demand down for fuel and power. And so, Mr. Speaker, that requires things like financing mechanisms that would enable people and businesses to get over that upfront capital cost hurdle. So there's a fundamental role there for government to play. And it's not clear, Mr. Speaker, that, well, there is no institution really whose mandate specifically to deliver on efficiency anymore. Bernard Lord's government created Efficiency New Brunswick to their credit. It won international awards. It was headed in a very positive direction, creating lots of work and helping to grow the energy efficiency sector of our economy, and saving New Brunswickers and New Brunswick businesses and industry a lot of money in the process, and inspired our neighboring province of Nova Scotia to create Efficiency One and actually build on the success of Efficiency New Brunswick to create something even better, which to this day continues to operate effectively in helping to move that province in the direction of reducing their demand for fuel and electricity, and therefore shrinking their carbon footprint, Mr. Speaker. So there's much more to do with the Climate Change Act. I had proposed in the last sitting of the legislature that since Efficiency New Brunswick was eliminated by the former government, that we replace it with something called Renew NB, that would have the responsibility to ensure that we leverage investments from households and businesses with their own money by seeding that with incentives and by providing financing mechanisms to make it easy, like zero-interest loans that you can pay back over a reasonable period of time without a huge burden being added to your monthly cash flow. Efficiency New Brunswick did that early on. It was very effective, for example. One example. Renew NB could also take on the responsibility for moving us to a system where we're substituting renewable energy for fossil fuels, because we need to do that for heating with solar and bioenergy, and we need to do that for power generation, because that's another essential element here, Mr. Speaker, to moving towards a low-carbon energy future, is to green the electrical grid and to decentralize it so that it's being powered by renewable sources of energy. We've got a vast diversity of renewable sources of energy in this province that are distributed around the province, which could be produced in every corner of New Brunswick and done so in a way to benefit our municipalities, our local governments, economic, financial bottom line, and of course reducing our carbon footprint at the same time while creating jobs and business opportunities. So that's another essential element here, Mr. Speaker. And of course, a third one is we need to transform our transportation system. And it's important to understand why, because when you look at the bulk of our carbon pollution is coming from three sources: generating electricity, moving us around and moving freight around, and refining oil into petroleum products. After that, everything else is fairly small. Those are the three big ones. So transportation is essential. So it means a transformation of our transportation system. We need to look at how we can reduce driving by ensuring we have reasonable public transportation between our cities and our rural regions and in our cities. And of course, the ESIC committee, the Economic and Social Inclusion Committee, has filed a report with some important recommendations that I hope the government implements that would help us get there. And then, of course, we have to start substituting fuels for transportation itself, whether it's biogas from our sewage plants and our municipalities to run city buses, or electricity to run cars and trucks, or biofuel like green diesel to run heavy equipment that uses diesel power. These are all essential to moving forward and provide, again, opportunities for New Brunswick to develop our economy in a different way than expanding the use of fossil fuels. So, Mr. Speaker, that just gives us I think the size of the challenge here to achieve the objectives that are going to be maintained, as the Minister said, in the Climate Change Act, but we have to get going. We fully implementing the climate action plan that the new government has endorsed, that was developed by the former government, will get us part of the way there. But it has to be implemented rapidly. There has to be a sense of urgency, Mr. Speaker, and that means ensuring that the center of government is committed to this. And in the Climate Action Plan, Mr. Speaker, there were clear commitments to ensure that would happen by establishing a cabinet committee chaired by the Premier, which we haven't heard about yet. The cabinet committees have been reduced to 2, Mr. Speaker, and this is a third and has not been established. And it's in the Climate Action Plan. So when the Premier says he's endorsing the Climate Action Plan and going to implement it, then he's got to implement it. Every MEC that comes to Cabinet is supposed to also include, according to the Climate Plan, include considerations about the impact on our carbon budget that is represented by the objectives in this Climate Change Act, Mr. Speaker. And that, to my knowledge, has not been implemented at this point. So it's also supposed to be included in the mandate letters for each minister, so that as part of their mandate, they take on a clear responsibility from the Climate Action Plan within their department, and to ensure that their stakeholders or clients or sectors that they're responsible for are lined up and helping to achieve these objectives within their area of activity. So, Mr. Speaker, we don't see any of that so far. And nor has there been, to my knowledge, any discussion with MLAs outside of the government caucus around this, as the Premier had committed to. This is important. This is urgent. And yet there's been no discussions about how to move forward, Mr. Speaker. And that's a bit surprising. There's MLAs with various expertise, no doubt, throughout this chamber. Personally, Mr. Speaker, I have been working in the area of climate policy since 1988. So I have a little bit of experience, Mr. Speaker, and it's something that would benefit New Brunswickers to have injected into the discussion about how we move forward with this bill that's being proposed here, and more broadly in the implementation of the climate plan. So, Mr. Speaker, we've got lots of work to do. I continue to offer my experience and expertise to the Premier, to the ministers responsible, and that of my caucus members, and I'm sure other members of this House are ready and willing to do the same, because this is, in reality, Mr. Speaker, moving from a high-carbon society to a low-carbon society, as the Climate Action Plan is entitled. C'est un projet de société, vraiment. And in English, there isn't a good term, Mr. Speaker, that reflects the weight of l'idée d'un projet de société. Something that engages everyone, which I know the Premier philosophically talks about. Everything is not up to government, and that's the case more than ever here. But government has to show leadership and put in place the resources and the policies and the legislation to ensure that we can make this great transformation that, in fact, we must do. Because, Mr. Speaker, bad things are happening now, badder things are going to happen soon as a result of climate change, because of the stalling that our province, our country, and many countries, not all, but many countries in the world have done over the years. And, Mr. Speaker, the task at hand is to avoid the worst from happening now. Because, sadly, we're not going to be able to ensure that our children are going to be better off than we are. They, in fact, are going to have some pretty major challenges to deal with, let's say, Mr. Speaker. It's not going to be pretty, I'm sad to say. But it's on us to play our role, to take our responsibility to ensure that we do everything we can do now, Mr. Speaker, so that they'll have a fighting chance in the future. Thank you.